Author and columnist Molly Ivins, good morning.
Morning.
You are an author.
I am. I've committed a book 3 times now.
When was it, how old were you? Well, let me start over.
1990, I think the first one was published.
Was it different being an author 9 years ago than it is today?
Very much so. And it's interesting, some of it is just numbers. Each of the books I have written has sold more than the previous one, but only the first one was ever on the bestseller list. In fact, it was on the New York Times bestseller list for 6 months, but it didn't sell as much as either of my subsequent books. One thing that's changed is that to make a bestseller list now, the book has to be a complete blockbuster. And the focus on the blockbuster in book publishing, the new Grisham, the new Danielle Steele, is just overwhelming. I think there's less and less chance for new authors, new unknowns to break through.
Your latest book is just out in paperback. You've Got to Dance with Them that brung you. How many has it sold in hardback? Do you know? I
really don't know, but it's doing all right, and they've in fact upped the paper printing. So
tomorrow, the National Review is going to release its 100 best nonfiction books of the century. By the National Review magazine is going to be doing that.
I doubt I'll be on that list.
You're not. However, and in a couple weeks, Modern Library is going to be releasing its best 100 nonfiction books of the century. If you had to choose, what would you put on the top of the list?
Well, I was interested. There have been some recent lists of 100 best jobs of journalism. And it's extraordinary, actually. I think the best journalism is being done in book form now. And probably John Hersey's Hiroshima would be very near the top.
Why?
Having brought attention, having made us think about the unthinkable, what we didn't want to face, what we'd done, what it meant, what the consequences were. And it may yet be that I can even remember years during the war in Vietnam when at some point somebody came up and said, well, what about dropping an atomic bomb? And the response was, oh, nobody would ever do that. And I thought, how interesting, because you see, we did twice, but we don't, it's one of those things we don't like to think about.
What's the most overrated nonfiction book?
Ooh, there's a good question. Well, it's certainly not of the century, but I can think of some that have been awfully silly. There's a whole genre, actually, recently that have made me just almost chuckle. These dreadful books, so to say. One is by Robert Bork, and one is by Bill Bennett. And they're about, supposedly, the fact that we all went wrong in the 60s.
Talking about Slouching Toward Gomorrah by Bob Bork.
Right.
And Mr. Bennett's was The Death of Outrage?
That's right. And how terrible and awful and dreadful and immoral we've all become as a result of that terrible decade.
There's some stories out today that say that
laugh.
Hillary Clinton's going to have a new book out.
I'm sure it will find an audience. I must say that strikes me as one of those insty books of no great wide interest.
Did you read It Takes a Village?
I think I skimmed it rather than read it.
What did you think of it?
So I didn't think it was bad. I thought she made some good points, and her thesis is certainly well taken.
There's also a little note this morning, as we're talking about books, that Monica Lewinsky has been talking with somebody. You know, it's this whole genre of celebrity books, celebrity everything. What an odd culture we live in. Why would we think that this poor young woman knew how to write a book? I mean, obviously she had to have someone write it for her, but even so, how rather painful. What's your favorite part about this book?
Well, I tell you, one of the things that I concentrate on in this book, if it has a theme, and it's sort of a mishmash, I guess, it's about the corruption of our political system by money and the need to fix that. I'm convinced that that is the numero uno source of the root of the rot in American politics is the money. And the good news is that fixing it is really not that difficult.
Hasn't been done yet.
I know, and people always started when I say that. Now, I tend to be optimistic to the point of idiocy as a congenital problem, but I will tell you that I not only think it can be done, I don't think it's that hard to do. Every time public campaign financing has been on the ballot anywhere. It's been approved by the voters. This last go-round, it was approved in both Massachusetts and Arizona, two states that are wildly dissimilar politically. I really am going to beg to differ with you a little there. And while it's true that the media in this country are owned more and more by large corporations that are all part of a sort of infotainment complex, I really don't think that's any reason to totally distrust or ignore all the sources of information. One of the good things about this country is that we do have access to an extraordinary amount of information if you seek it out, if you're assiduous about seeking it out from an extraordinary range of sources, so that I don't think you need feel that some, the establishment media are pulling the wool over your eyes. There, you certainly have the ability to go out and check things out in other directions. The second thing is that I really don't think, I think it's a little bit hard to make a case that our painful involvement in the Kosovo-Serbia mess is somehow the consequence of some plot or conspiracy, or that we have hidden motives. You referenced the oil fields of Central Asia. Well, they're not in Kosovo, and I don't think that has anything to do with it, and I frankly think that we have been dragged so reluctantly that it probably speaks ill of us into finally doing something about a situation that is so bad that it's a little bit hard to believe. Now, I like you, tend to think, the old truism, the first casualty in war is truth, and when we hear some of these horror stories, you think, boy, that sounds like the rape of the Belgian nuns back in World War I, which was a famous myth propagated by war propagandists. And yet, I think there is sufficient information and sufficient number of sources for us to be able to believe that there are terrible atrocities being committed. That's why we got involved in the first place.
Is there any part of this that you don't agree with? In terms of how the United States is reacting?
Well, I think everyone's entitled to their reaction. It seemed to me that our choice this time, since we'd made a number of bad choices going back at least 2 administrations, was to do nothing or to do something. And I am absolutely convinced that doing nothing was not an option this time. It just wasn't. Well, it's a bit like when one does occasionally feel like the little boy pointing out that the emperor was not wearing any clothes and was, in fact, just buck naked. We point out the rather obvious fact that the war on drugs is a disaster, really, and has not only not done what it was supposed to do, but the unintended consequences, as we say in the charming language of the Pentagon, the collateral damage in the war on drugs has been the Bill of Rights.
Well, if you can see here exactly how he talks about George W.
George W., he's misspelled W. Let me point that out.
D-U-B-Y-U-H.
D-U-B-Y-A.
A-H. Okay.
No, D-U-B-Y-A is the
Y-A.
way it is spelled in Texas, and we do call him George W. That's the short way
Maybe
he's
this is the
referred
New
to.
York version?
Yeah, in New York, that they've Yankeefied the W there. There's an extent to which I'm actually, for a change, sympathetic with George W. on some of the kinds of media coverage he's getting. Once again, because the man is running for president, they're going to come down and try and look into his private sex life and whether or not he ever used drugs and a bunch of stuff that I think it's just not anybody's business. I really believe that. But his public record, I think everybody's entitled to look at. And the thing about George W. is really, there's not much there. I mean, at this point, it seems to me the poor man is suffering from inflated expectations to a point that's absolutely painful. There's nothing wrong with the guy. He really is not much.
Is there anything in his public record that you could think could trip him up in a presidential campaign?
Well, yeah, I think if they spend all this time making a big fuss about this Whitewater land deal for Clinton, somebody's going to go back and look at that Harkin Energy deal of George W.'s. He was associated with a little energy company called Harkin that had a deal with the government of Bahrain. And this was when Big George was president, his daddy. The question of whether or not he sold his stock with insider knowledge is, I think, a legitimate one to raise. I think the whole question of the fact, here's a man who goes around preaching that people ought to stand on their own feet, take responsibility for their lives, not depend on the government. The reason this man made $14 million is because the taxpayers built a stadium for his baseball team. I mean, a little contradiction between rhetoric and performance there.
Oh, exactly. That's why this system of campaign finance is so insane. And the truth is that if you had public campaign financing, you could probably finance all the federal offices for less than $5 a head.
For less than $5 a head?
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Well, as you know, we've had a system of public campaign financing for presidential campaigns that worked just fine through 4 cycles. And then, as often happens, the big money found a way around the restrictions, and this soft money started to build up 2 cycles ago. And this last time, 96, it was just a flood tide pouring in. But as you know, we have at the end of the IRS thing, there's a little box you check, and it says, you know, check here if you want to kick in a couple of bucks to keep the presidential campaign honest. And that really did work for 4 cycles. And what you would do, again, is cut off the soft money. That's the simplest, easiest thing to do. And you'll notice that a majority of both houses of Congress has actually voted in favor of that. Then just go ahead and widen that pool of public money to include all the federal officials, to include Congress, because it seems to me that we now have a government of corporate special interests, and by corporate special interests, and for corporate special interests to an extent that is just blinding. And, you know, one of the things when people say, oh, well, there's not enough grassroots activism in politics, people ought to get involved, I myself am depressed by the level of cynicism and the superciliousness with which people regard politics, and yet I have to tell you that I also think it's justified. I think people understand very correctly that this system is not working for them.
Do you know where Bay City, Texas is?
I sure do.
Well, that's where your next call is. Where's it from? Where is it?
Well, it's right down there on the Texas Gulf Coast. It's Representative Tom Euher's district.
I think that our involvement is not so much as, well, I suppose all our sense of right and wrong does ultimately come from in a religious-inspired sense of ethics. But again, when you haul the name of religion into conflict, as history will show you, you get unusually bloody results. And I think very often that what passes for religious conflict, for example, in Northern Ireland, when you look at it closely, will turn out to be a class issue. Oddly enough, sometimes ethnic conflict, like the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda, also turns out to be a class, that is, one group being economically oppressed by another. And I don't think that's what we have here in a case of extraordinary bloody-mindedness. In fact, what we have here is one of those relatively rare cases in history where you see so clearly the consequences of dreadful political leadership. And that's why I think it's worth taking a real close look at who we're going to choose to lead us.
In 35 minutes, the House of Representatives comes in. One of the first things they're going to do is pray.
Well,
What do you think of that?
I really, on the whole, have no objection, although I will tell you it leads to controversy. In Texas, of course, we have the visiting preachers come in every day, preach over the legislature, touched off a great theological controversy this year. Normally, the preachers just come in, ask the Lord for mercy, and leave, which is a very sensible response to our legislature. But this year, not one but 2 of the visiting preachers has either stated or implied that the members of the Texas legislature are there sent by God. And I want to tell you, it touched off quite a storm around the Capitol and a big debate about whether or not God could be fairly blamed for the Texas legislature, and majority sentiment in the building is, nah.
Will they be back?
You know, this is really interesting to me that I think you're in an attempt to define Christian as people who believe in a certain very strict ways on certain given subjects. And I'm a great believer in that part of the New Testament that you find printed in red.
And when you go back and read that, I think you will find that it was Christ's main emphasis not to separate out and to say, well, you don't think on, you have to think exactly this way and exactly that way. What you find there is a much more loving acceptance of all kinds of sinners, all kinds of sinners. Let me make that argument, because I think that is one that you hear quite often. You know, how come we're going to go intervene here? We didn't do it in Rwanda. We didn't do it hither and yon. It's not an argument. Think about this. You can't logically make an argument saying we shouldn't do anything about this specific act of evil because we haven't stopped other acts of evils. That's not going to parse, is it? I think he's right. Again, I think the doing nothing option, I just don't see how you could justify it. Not this time, not when you knew what Milosevic was going to do. We watched it happen in Bosnia. You didn't just sit there and watch genocide and do nothing, and we knew it was going to happen again. And so I think doing nothing was not an option. Now, he raises the question, you know, the strategy of the something we chose to do. And yeah, I think you can legitimately raise those questions, but again, I point out it's a question of 20/20 hindsight, and it is always a lot easier to see in retrospect what you should have done. And one of the things that strikes me, and it strikes me particularly about political debate here in Washington, is the extraordinary amount of time that is spent on could have, should have, would have. The extraordinary amount of time that is spent on blame. Whose fault is it? There was an interesting study done a couple of years back. I'm sorry, I cannot remember the author. Comparing the differences between corporate culture of Japan and corporate culture of the United States. And what the authors found is that in Japan, when something goes terribly wrong and, you know, your widgets aren't working right or whatever, everybody involved just throws themselves at the problem, and they all work like mad, and they recall the defective widgets and get everything ironed out, and then the top guy, the jefe, we would say in Texas, more or less literally falls on his sword. He's the responsible party there. When something goes terribly wrong, according to this study in American corporate culture, the great thing is the blame game. Everybody runs around saying, who's responsible for this? We'll find out, and heads will roll. And in politics, we do that all the time. Whose fault is this? We'll find out who's responsible, and we'll get them. You know, there comes a time where it really doesn't matter who is responsible for the fact that the situation is a mess. You have to concentrate on what you can do about it. You know, I see where you're going with this, and let me tell you, I think you're right. And I don't mean to knock specific people in my business, in the news media, but I will tell you that I think the fact that average reporters now make upper middle class salaries at the major newspapers. Those of us who still work for papers in the provinces, I assure you, are nowhere nearly this well paid. But at the major newspapers, and certainly at the television networks, when you have reporters, normal reporters making upper middle class salaries, or even, as she points out, upper class salaries, big rich salaries, it actually does make a difference in how they cover the news. It does make a difference in your perspective. I can remember when I was at the New York Times, we ran a 27-inch story on the fact that place cards at dinner parties were back in. Now, I assure you, that is not of wide interest to the general readership. This is a level of because people who are financially comfortable, even though they may think they have the interest and sympathies of an understanding of the problems of those who are less well off in mind, you don't. I will tell you, somebody who spent 6 years below the poverty level. You have no understanding of what it's like to be poor unless you have been fairly recently and over a long period of time. You know, there are a lot of people who are well-to-do now who didn't start out well-to-do. Nevertheless, I think that people who started out middle class or even better and have never known poverty have no understanding of what it's like to be in a position where the slightest financial setback is an absolute catastrophe.
I know at least 3 things that you do. Your column for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, syndicated column then.
Syndicated.
And then your book, your authorship. Which one makes the most money for you, personally?
You know, I'm embarrassed to say I'm not sure. No, I think it's my salary from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and I am going to talk to them about my salary. I'm telling you, I'm looking up those new numbers. Well, I get paid a lot less than our football writer, believe me.
Syndicated columnists are paid by the paper that picks them up, or?
That's right. That's
By
right.
the number of papers.
Yeah, and it depends. It's a sliding scale. Like a large paper would have to pay maybe $35, and your little podunk Daily Hallelujah would pay $4 or $5.
How many papers are you in nationwide?
About
Do you know?
220. Yeah.
Geographically?
I'm sure the greatest number in any individual state is Texas, but a surprising number of out-of-state papers take that column. Actually, let me point out, I understand, you know, why you would say that, and yet I'd beg to differ. I am one of the few people in the world who will say this right here in front of God and everybody. I actually like politicians, but I am hoping to find some more socially acceptable perversion. I thought maybe interspecies dating would win me more friends. I do like politicians, though. That is the truth. And I'll tell you, they hate this system. And you're saying, okay, how come they don't change it? Look what happened this last time in Congress. A majority of the House passed their little reform bill. A majority of the Senate passed their little reform bill, the McCain-Feingold. Despite the fact that the leadership of both houses, they weren't just twisting arms, they were breaking arms on that one. And I'll tell you exactly why. Because incumbents have an enormous political advantage. The Republicans now hold the majority in Congress. That means effectively they have a 3-to-1 funding advantage over the Democrats. When the Democrats had the majority, they had exactly the same attitude toward changing the system. It worked so much to their benefit, they couldn't afford to change it. And yet, despite the fact that there is this tremendous built-in advantage for the Republicans, enough of them hate this system that they crossed over and voted with a majority. Could not get the 2/3 needed to kill a filibuster in the Senate, but you had a majority of politicians in both houses vote for it because they hate this system. They have to spend about 50% of their time kissing people's behinds in order to get money to run for next time. They hate it.
This is Molly Ivins' book. It's been out how long?
That came out in paperback just about a month ago.
But the hardback
And
came
the
out.
hardback a year ago.
If you come down to this blurb right down here in the front of the paperback version, People magazine called you
Fine institution.
acerbic.
Acerbic.
Do you
yes.
like that word?
Yeah, well, I think so. I myself am,
Of course, the myth of human kindness runs strong in my every vein, and it is part of the liberal creed, you know, that we are absolute fountains of kindness and caring and compassion for everybody from the glandular obese to milk-shy Hottentots. We liberals are full of compassion for them. But I must say, American politics occasionally moves me to become somewhat acerbic.
Is it easier to be acerbic in print than it is for you to
Oh, no,
speak it?
no.
Or is it easier?
It's much easier for people to mistake the intent in print, but particularly with humor. Humor is terribly difficult to write. It is much easier because so much of humor, any comedian will tell you this, is in timing. And just a little flick of the eyebrow, a little smile, people will know that you're just kidding, or they'll know, you know, from your tone of voice that you meant that as a mild jibe rather than a real sword slash. And it's very easy in print to have people mistake your intent.
Do you read to somebody do you read your columns to somebody to figure out, or do you just trust yourself?
It's years of experience, but I will tell you, you can, it's terribly easy to hurt somebody when you think you're just being funny. Humor is very dangerous and tricky in print.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that is a legitimate question, and I think she has raised a very good issue. And I think the difference there, and I'm exactly right, red flags, hesitation, watch out here, what kind of precedent are we setting? And she's so right, too, although I don't think that the media have been somehow trying to hide the fact that there was a Kosovo Liberation Army raising hell over there. I do think that our double problem here is that we already knew how Milosevic was going to handle it. You see, he not only did we have the example of Bosnia, but he had said that he was going to go in and do this. And there you have it. Well, now, you may have to help me on that second question.
Sure.
Let me go to a first one. Excellent point. And I am convinced that without touching the First Amendment top side or bottom, you could effectively say, pass a law saying,
No candidate for public office shall be permitted to buy either time or space in any news medium, period, paragraph. Compensatory time and space shall be provided by the media. I am convinced that you can do that without hurting the First Amendment, because the people of this country own the airwaves. They are our airwaves. And I think we have every right to demand that of broadcast and print in this country. Print benefits from special constitutional protections and privileges. Now, on your numero 2 question there, my understanding is that anybody with regular White House press credentials goes to
I think that's true. But the question is, you have to have White House press credentials.
And is that terribly selective? The only person I ever know... Well, now there's a question. I don't have White House press credentials, but I tell you what I have. I have such regular credentials that it would be very easy, as I understand it, for me to get fixed up with White House pass. The only guy I ever knew who was denied White House press credentials is my good friend Bob Sherrill, who once took a swing at the governor of Florida, or at least at his press secretary, and consequently was down as a dangerous person. And let him have a White House press pass, which, as he points out, made him a much better reporter here in Washington for many years.
Now, there's a person who is not given to understatement and is as nasty a stew of hatred as I've ever heard. And I will tell you that I honestly believe that people boiling with that kind of rage so that they would say these kinds of things must just tear up your insides to be like that. I tell you, you know you're just hurting yourself with that kind of terrible anger. Get a grip. First place, no. During Desert Storm, I never disrespected our troops in any way, shape, or form. Did not do that during Vietnam either, for very good reason. And to assume that anybody who supports this, it is not would not have a child or somebody they cared about at risk of going, what an idiotic assumption. Wow, absolutely unfounded. On the fact that we're killing people who are not our enemies, yeah, that's true. We are doing so in an effort to prevent their slaughter by this man who has a terrible record, and we know would go ahead and do that. Now, the fact that it's a bloody mess, that, of course, should give anybody pause, but why you would simply seize on the one side without considering the other is simply beyond me. You know, I have heard several people refer sort of ironically to the fact, and this one is so complicated. I mean, anybody who thinks that it's history. First of all, this is the one thing I think we can say with great assurance about this whole situation is anybody who tells you it's simple is a moron. And the political reaction is equally complicated. And the fact that quite a few people who used to be doves on Vietnam or Desert Storm are now hawks on this one, and vice versa. I mean, they're just sit around saying, well, you're a hypocrite, you're a hypocrite. It's a kind of useless discussion. I was thinking, though, somebody would raise that question about people like me who had been doves in Vietnam. You know, that was another real complicated situation, but I don't recall that Ho Chi Minh ever committed genocide. There's another extraordinary part of the extraordinary complexity of this problem. Because Milosevic has committed genocide, you would assume that there would be an immense outcry from the Jewish community. But here's another complicated piece of history. During World War II, the Serbs were anti-Nazi. They were incredibly brave and ferocious partisan fighters who put up an incredible resistance in the mountains of their country, led by Tito, who later became the head of Yugoslavia. They were extraordinary fighters and really held off the Nazis from the entire war and helped Jews escape. So there is a debt of gratitude by the Jewish people toward the Serbs, so that's part of the complexity of this whole situation. Oh, I mean, everybody's perfectly happy with George W. down in Texas, but in Texas, we have what is known in political science circles as the weak governor system, and boy, is ours weak. And that's not me telling you that. I mean, anybody would tell you that. And both constitutionally and by the rules of the Senate, and until recently by force of personality, the lieutenant governor had far more clout in Texas than the governor, and the arrangement for George W.'s first
first term was that he pretty much did what Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock told him to, and that worked out real well for everybody. And basically in Texas, if you're the governor and you don't raise taxes, everybody's happy. You know what I'll also say, and let me do something, I do give him credit for this. I think George W. has real political skills. Everybody likes him. He wanders around the state being affable. You would have to work at it to dislike the guy. And I think his political skills also show in the fact that he has been smart enough to woo the Hispanic community in a very serious way, unlike this doofus out in California, Pete Wilson. The third thing I think you could see the political skills is in the way he's handled the fact that his state Republican Party is very firmly in the hands of the Christian right in Texas. And he has managed to keep a very moderate face on it, despite the fact that they passed these amazing platforms. And that, I think, all of that speaks well for his political skills. I'm not saying he doesn't have political skills. I've just never seen any symptom that he's really interested in governing. He's not terribly interested in policy. He doesn't seem to read much or care much about it. I really don't understand why he wants to be president.
Is your legislative session over?
No, we're in the middle of it.
When does it get over? We're told that that's when he's going to start making his forays outside of the state.
Well, we could sure use his help on some issues down home.
What's the biggest issue facing him between now and
whether or not
session?
we can get the state to pass health insurance for poor kids up to 200% of poverty. As you know, it's not even our money, and here's it's federal money. Here's the legislature sitting around going, yeah, I don't know. I don't want to do that. There are different ways to read that. You can even, there's even a kind of sad one, like it's almost like a footnote to the Kosovo situation. One of the things the Republicans want to do in order to have enough money to give people a tax cut is cut the funding for, once again, they've been doing this for quite a while, the State Department, the foreign aid, and the embassies, all of which, if you look back in all the could-have, would-have, should-have that might have given us a few better options than we currently have in this Kosovo mess. All of them involve if we had said to Milosevic then, if we had known then, if we'd had more people on the ground, if we'd had a better reporting system, if we'd spent the money on those very things. In other words, if you spend more money on diplomacy, you're less likely to wind up ultimately having to bomb people. And as Mr. Churchill once said, jaw, jaw is better than war, war.
Speaking of Mr. Churchill, and going back to where we began, which is the National Review's 100 list of best nonfiction books of the century coming out tomorrow, number 1, The Second World War by Winston Churchill.
Oh, interesting, interesting
What do you
pick.
think of that pick?
That's a very interesting pick. I think there are better histories of that war, actually. And the British military historian, who's with 3 initials, whose name is now escaping me, is probably one of them. But an interesting pick because Churchill is such a majestic writer.
Hayek has 2 books on the top 10.
Really?
F.A. Hayek.
Really?
What do you think of that?
Well, I thought that's another interesting pick. Boy, we're going to have some good arguments about this one, aren't we?
Well, between now and when the Modern Library is one, do you think there's going to be a lot different list coming out of the Modern Library?
There is. Well, ML, yeah, although some people criticize and say they tended to, pick their own writers.
The 78, number 78, and number 77 and 78 is The Good Society by Walter Lippmann, and number 78 is Silent Spring by Rachel Carson.
I would have put Carson higher, and I think Lippmann's Public Opinion is the more seminal work.
Do you think that, are you surprised that she's on the National Review's Best 100 list at all?
It would be hard put to ignore her, wouldn't they? Yes, ultimately, this is when we are there because it's a moral issue. And even beyond that, as she points out, our previous inaction, allowing these hideous man to continue, gives us a kind of, makes us complicit, morally complicit in a way that I think makes it even more incumbent on us to act.
Do you have any problems with the amount of money we might be spending over there?
Well, sure, I hate to see it, and what a tragedy. But I'd much rather, as long as we're there, I'd much rather spend more money and get it done and give the military everything they need to do the job right than fool around.